Hi, it's me, Nathaniel. My paper that I chose was called Dietary Carbohydrates, Role of Quality and Quantity in Chronic Disease, and that's by David Ludwig, Frank Hu, Luck Tappy, and Johnny Brandmiller. One of the first points was about role of carbohydrate consumption in human development, and basically it's talking about the evolutionary factors that carb has had over the beginning of time. So we know that the brain requires a lot of energy, more than other primates, and it gets that primarily through what we eat. And in the beginning, we start out as hunter-gatherers, according to these standpoints, and the dietary tract is like largely unknown at that time. We haven't really been able to find the fossil record too much for humans of this time because it all dissolves, so we don't know exactly what their digestive tract was. But it's assumed that carbohydrate yielding foods such as like ripe fruit, grains, and then later on they could cook them into other things, supplied the evolution of the gastrointestinal tract in order to compensate for early struggles to find carb-rich food. Maybe they ate too much meat, maybe they didn't eat enough fruit, they didn't know maybe. And so this is the high energy needs of the brain, but they're not eating enough carbohydrates to compensate for it. So something had to change in the digestive tract, it's assumed. And a lot of Christians kind of, go down on evolution, and some parts of it are absolutely crazy, I think. But going through here, especially at Florida College, I think it's interesting to learn that a lot of Christians are really misguided on evolution. A lot of it really goes hand in hand. There's microevolution and macroevolution, and even evolution itself. No one's stating that if you put a fish in a bucket and wait 3 days, it's going to evolve into a bird that can get out of the bucket. No one's saying that. Not even evolutionists are saying that. But it's interesting to see that there could have been a change, especially in a lot of points in time where it's silent in the Bible. How long were Adam and Eve in the garden? How long was it in Genesis between the days of creation? That's the term. It's a hotly controversial argument in Greek. There's all sorts of things going on, and we just don't know the time limits. It's possible human bodies could have changed. It's possible they couldn't. Maybe there are these long periods of time where things changed, and we really just don't know. But I like to think God created us the way we are, and I'm not sure we had huge foreheads. Maybe just some weird people living up north, or societies that put the cones on their heads to change their size. Who knows? But in this viewpoint, the Neolithic period brought the rise of an agrarian lifestyle. So this would have been about 12 to 14,000 years ago. And basically, humans have developed fine farming and cooking, and we're living off of fruit. Now, so now the carb compensation is really high. Our diets and carbs are super high compared to what they were when we were just hunter-gatherers. And so now the digestive tract is changing again to meet our high-carb diet instead of the low-carb diet. And it's at this time that carb deficiencies come out, such as diet problems with dental caries, which we talked about in class, height decreases, and nutrient deficiency because they're overeating in carbs and not getting a lot of other stuff since they've switched to agrarian lifestyles. The next point in the article was talking about a relationship between carbohydrate types and the health outcomes. So as we talked about in class, carbs are classified by chain length. You have monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, etc., etc. And based on this chain length, some of them can raise glucose and some foods can lower it. So diabetes remains the central struggle for carb diets, since some carbs actually raise glucose more than sugars, and then some sugars are better than some carbohydrates. And really one of the overarching points in this article was it matters about the quality of carbs that you eat, not just the quantity. There's that famous diet of the guy losing, there's this famous video of this guy losing like 30 pounds and he ate nothing but McDonald's on his diet. But he just measured his caloric intake and everything. And while obviously that's not healthy whatsoever, it just goes to prove a point that you can do things by measuring intake rather than just the amount that you eat, and vice versa. Carbs are the only constituent food group that directly increases blood glucose, what has a direct correlation with it. And while carb consumption is important, like I said, what's more important is the type of carb eaten. So there's two ways of measuring this. There's the glycemic index, which is kind of a catch-all, like ideally every food would be compared like this. And then there's the glycemic load, which is the more accurate. People are probably consuming this. The glycemic index for the world is a lot different than the glycemic load for America because we're consuming way more carbs or way more processed carbs than these other nations. A lot of nations actually consume higher carbs than us, but they're eating a lot more rice and things like that. So fiber converted fatty acids via fermentation, some of it gets converted by the cell microbiota and just gets moved to more fatty acids for some energy. And then we talked also in class about added sugars and about the varied health benefits that they have. Some people discuss that, over time, a lot of added sugars are bad for you. Some people maintain that added sugars are okay when you monitor them. Some people just really don't know at all, and the research is still really forthcoming about it. And it's hit or miss, but really they just tell you kind of avoid it too much over all time, and you should be good. And take care of your teeth, please. The youngest set of dentures my dad ever did was on a 13-year-old boy who had lost all of his teeth. So I would try to avoid all the added sugars that I could, but they are needed for your body, so don't particularly go out of your way to avoid them entirely. The next point was called How Do Carbohydrate-Containing Foods Affect Your Health? And again, debated because every person is different. Some people have deficiencies, some people don't. It's different for people with diabetes. It's different for people who don't have diabetes. It's different for people in other countries who don't have as much access to carbs. It's different on people who have access to better carbs or more processed carbs or GMO carbs. It's really, really different for everybody. So let's just talk about 4 groups of them. One of them is grains. We talked about them being raw or refined. The raw ones kind of have like all the kernels and everything, and then they get refined and they lose some of the bran and everything, and then they can get really refined where it's just flour. Whole grains are somewhat related to a reduced cholesterol, and refined grains intake is associated with type 2 diabetes because it doesn't have a lot of the more healthy parts. And then whole grain risks are also associated with eating too much whole grain, and that can include coronary heart disease and stroke. So really it's kind of a double-edged sword. Whichever one you pick, overeating either of them can be bad for you, so you have to moderate both of them. And then make sure you be careful to observe what type of grain you really are getting. Some of them advertise to be a whole grain, but they can say that, and you may be getting a refined grain. You may not really know. Or you may just be getting flour, so really be sure to check and see what you're getting. Next are potatoes. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew, as Samwise Gamgee would say. It's a positive correlation between potatoes eaten and weight gain. This is not surprising, living in America where we live on a high potato diet. French fries are everywhere. It's just bad because we have these really processed potatoes, and it can result in hypertension, a lot of heart problems. They have a high glycemic index, and they resemble refined grains in what they are. So it's associated with type 2 diabetes, which again, not a surprise. America is an epidemic of diabetes, and it's because we sell them. We sell these French fries, we sell these other high potato processed foods at almost every restaurant, and they're everywhere and they're easy to consume. Perhaps the best for you are legumes. In fact, we talked about them in class being kind of a superfruit. Well, not really a superfood, superfood. And they reduce cholesterol, they have a low glycemic index, they reduce cardiovascular disease risk, they can be nutrient dense, they can control blood pressure. They are kind of the magic seeds for helping your body out. We don't eat enough legumes, and we really should eat more. And then fruits. Regular consumption of fruit trends with a decrease in disease. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Kind of just everything you're told. They're high in fiber, vitamins, and minerals, and they're really good for you. Just don't overeat them because they have a lot of really natural sugar, and that can also be bad for you and get bad for your teeth. Take care of your teeth, take care of your body. But interestingly enough, fruit juices are somewhat controversial because they have lower health benefits, and they're often not entirely paired in the same health categories as whole fruits. So they're paired into a different place. The next point is, what are the metabolic effects of carbohydrates in populations? And so this is pretty self-explanatory. Obviously high carbs can have negative benefits, but some of them actually, I was surprised, have somewhat positive benefits. And again, it's about the quality of carbs versus the quantity of carbs. So high carb diets are traditionally associated with longevity, healthier brains. Now this shouldn't be a shocker because we talked about the carbs supplying energy to the brain. So if your brain has more energy, it's probably going to be healthy and have more neuroplasticity for when things get damaged and everything like that. So again, that's not really a shocker, but these are not as processed carbs that are shown to have this healthy effect going to the brain. Because the more processed the carb is, the more fat is getting added to it. And so how much of this carb energy you're actually getting versus how much of this fat energy are you actually getting. So this is in places like Japan, right? You don't see very many fat Japanese individuals or very many fat Indian individuals. Their carbs are not very processed. They're eating natural things and they're keeping healthier brains, and they have some insane longevity. I think Japan or Nepal has the highest longevity in the world. I'm not sure. I didn't check that. But their diet is a large part of that. But 18 countries with processed grains found increased mortality. And this is particularly in processed white rice, because we have different types. You have jasmine, regular, white, and you can walk it. Um, Rice is really usually processed and it's not consumed in its natural state. And so this can relate to mortality because the more you eat of it, it's very rich and it can give you too much. And in the US, it is positively correlated to mortality because of the fats that we add. Again, this is the problem of quantity versus quality. We may not consume as many as these other nations, but we are eating way worse versions of these carbs than they are. Studies show that low carb diets help weight loss short term more than low fat diets, but the health benefits of both over long term are diminished. Again, this shouldn't be a shocker. Your body is a finely oiled machine. What you take in and what you put out are very important. And they say too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, or too little can be a bad thing. So you have less carbs for a while, you're losing weight, but are you really healthily losing weight? And then cutting out fat, your fat is an excellent supply of energy that your body uses when other sources of energy are low, and so is your carbohydrate for your brain. So you're really starving your body of nutrients while trying to do weight loss, and that's just not the way to go. Really, physical exercise and an all-around balanced diet is the best way to go. Of course, some people have insulin deficiencies. They have insulin resistance or metabolic deficiencies that greatly affect carb diets. If you have insulin deficiency, obviously carbs are going to be a lot worse for you. Or if you have heart problems or anything, and you're probably going to want to avoid and really carefully monitor what type of carbs you're eating because it can upset your condition in a heartbeat. Kind of a pun with metabolic deficiency, I guess. Some people have early insulin secretion. I found this interesting. Before the food gets completely adjusted, the pancreas just prematurely releases insulin, and the food doesn't get processed correctly, and a lot more of it gets turned into fat, and you gain weight way faster than you would. In fact, they when they were talking about the hunter-gatherers, they really talked about this gene that is evident in some older fossils, and that's AMY1, which is correlating to amylase. And high AMY1 basically means the uptake of fat is increased, which increases survival, right? You got to think in these times, a lot of people would have a lot of fat on them. So if they're caught out in a long winter for a couple of days, or they're thin, they're sticks, they probably don't have the fat on them to survive. Now you take the average American, you put them out there, they may last a lot longer, assuming they can find water. But we say a week without water, maybe 2 or 3 without food, the human can survive. But these people weren't the same. And so they had high AMY1, they had higher survival age. So a lot of the older fossils that they found have high AMY1 genes in their genomic record. Now again, this is misused today because this gene is still prevalent. And, higher uptake of fat obviously means increased risk of diabetes. So some people really, unfortunately, are just born with a genomic deficiency that they can't really do much about. And it really is going to affect their diabetes and their way of controlling things. And then high starch intake and low AMY1 has the lowest body mass. It shouldn't be surprising. It has the least uptake of fat, and they're eating really healthy carbs instead of more processed ones. So that has the lowest body index, unsurprisingly. In conclusion, a high glycemic index for carbs are the reason for the diabetes epidemic. Just comparatively, the United States has way higher on the index of processed carbs instead of healthier carbs. And carb quality, like I've been saying throughout this whole article, has the highest effect rather than carb amount. So just what you eat rather than how much of you're eating it is really important. And it varies among individuals. This is one thing that is kind of unfortunate. Like I said, some people are just born with this intolerance and they can't do anything about it, and it's going to affect the rest of their lives, or they have a gluten allergy or something, and that can offset your carb intake completely. And it has varied health risks for individuals. Some individuals don't really struggle with diabetes or MIs or other things like that. Some people, it runs in the family, and I can think of people I've talked to where their grandfather died of a heart attack, their mother died of a heart attack, their dad died of a heart attack, and then they presume that they're going to die of a heart attack. You meet people like that. A really common one is mothers dying in childbirth. It seems to be genetically correlated. If your great-grandmother, your grandmother, and your mother died in childbirth, it's sadly not looking good. But there are families like that. And there's some problems with research, right? Obviously, it'd be hard to take an entire population and study them individually throughout the entire course of their lives to get this full impact of what carbs and food do. And with nutrition being a relatively new science, we don't have this data from older generations. So really we're looking at our genome and the fossil record genome, and there's this kind of this gray area in between as to what's really changed and what's been going on. Um, One of my hopes is I'm a proponent of genetic research, and I really hope that starting, hopefully sometime in the future, when babies are born, they're going to be able to look at their genome and say, okay, they have this deficiency. Make sure throughout their life they're getting this amount of carbs, this not amount of carbs, this amount of fruits, this not amount of fruits. I really think genetic research is going to up and coming and really help with this, especially with preventing type 1 diabetes. And, hopefully with CRISPR editing and stuff like that that's up and coming, we can start to get rid of that. But really with type 2 diabetes, it's this man-made epidemic. And I really hope that we find some way to get out of this by bettering our food standards and also just by bettering our genome. As crazy as that sounds, sometime in the future. I've cited the resource here, and then just some reflection. I learned about early human evolution. That was really kind of interesting to me about how food affected the digestional tract over the course of evolution, which again is pretty feasible. You think of the Israelites going into a land full of milk and honey, and it's kind of interesting that's denoted. Maybe they haven't had a land of milk and honey before, and it's certainly feasible to think that their digestive systems changed moving into Canaan from being wanderers before. The food in Egypt is not the same food that is in Canaan. So it's assumed that, their digestive tracts could have changed. I haven't really thought about that from a biblical perspective, but it makes sense. And I would really actually like to learn a lot more about that. Much research is still forthcoming. We talked about in class, nutrition is a new science. It's up and coming. So a lot of this research is being done, and a lot of it's being done in small, controlled groups where you kind of already know the outcome. Okay, we're going to feed these people a high amount of carbs and see what happens. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Obviously, the study is going to show a positive correlation between health increase or health decrease and weight gain. And you have to genomically study these people beforehand. Do they have high insulin secretion? Do they have low insulin secretion? Do they have diabetes? There's a lot of things that go on that really just aren't included in these studies that are really hard to measure. It would be a massive study to try to measure all of that in a small population, even a small city. Trying to measure everyone's genomic intake and see what would happen. It's kind of far-fetched. We're talking about the types of carbs and their effects. Different foods like legumes are this masterpiece of a carb that you should eat way more of. And my hope for future genomic research, which I went over on the last slide, I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And a lot of people think it's like playing God or whatever, and I understand some of that. But I think something that benefits the health of the human being, of God's creation, I think that's a good thing. I think modern medicine is a good thing, and I think that if we use it the right way, it's going to help a lot of people out, and I'm excited to help people out. Thank you.